Hey everyone, welcome back to the Untrivial Podcast. My name is Allie Nelson. Thank you to everyone who voted in this week's poll on Instagram on which episode topic you wanted aired first. And so today is a little bit of a different kind of episode. We are talking about death and dying, but more importantly, what we can learn from someone who sits with those people day in and day out. My guest today is John Wenderlein. John is a hospice chaplain who supports dying patients and makes sure they leave this world with someone by their side. John is also the author of two books, one specifically about veterans, where he shares the stories of patients he's worked with and what we can learn from people approaching end of life. Today, we discuss what exactly a chaplain does, what it's like to work in a hospice setting, how to handle regrets at the end of life, supporting veterans, whether or not people are generally at peace with dying, what John believes is most important to lead a full life, and so much more. John said it was okay if I said this, but honestly, this conversation felt like sitting down with your grandpa and listening to him share all the wisdom of his life. I really loved talking to John about his work, his religion, and his patients, and so I really hope you all enjoy. And now, let's get into the episode. John Wenderlein, welcome to the Untrivial Podcast. How are you doing today?
Allie, I'm doing wonderful. I want to thank you for allowing me to come and just to share.
Oh, my pleasure. Well, thank you so much for being here. You are probably the person with the most unique profession I've had on the show thus far, and I'm really excited to talk with you about it. But for those who don't know, I would love if you could share a little bit about your background and your job.
Well, my background is I was a minister, am a minister. Currently, I'm working as a hospice chaplain. I've been doing that for about 8, 10 years. Prior to that, I worked, bivocationally, always wanting to be something and do something more active for the Lord.
I love that. So, how did you become a chaplain, or what drew you to the hospice space and caring for people who were in their end of life?
Well, Allie, I was in seminary in the early 2000s, and one of our presidents had got us into a war. And they were calling up the National Guard, and some of my classmates were younger men, because I was 40 at the time, and they were being called up. And they were nervous and they were worried. They had signed up for the National Guard for the education, not to play soldier so much. So it just caused me to think and caused me to wonder. And I read an article, and I don't know where I read it, but it said for every 1,200 to 1,500 soldiers in all our branches, there was but one chaplain. And it just wouldn't leave me alone. I just couldn't imagine anyone coming to the end of their life alone. So I came home and told my wife, I said, baby, I think I'm going to join the military. And I tried. I tried everywhere. My dad was Navy, so I tried there first. And I was 40 years old, a little too old.
Hmm.
So at the time I was working bivocationally, and it didn't stop me from wondering, how to be one. And I happened to be dropping a bill off to one of my clients, and I looked on the door as I left his office, and it said hospice. And I thought to myself, 10, 12 years ago, I said, hospice? Oh, that's those people who deal with people who are dying. I didn't have a good understanding. So I walked in there and said, hey, everybody, I've got my degrees. I just like to help. And, I went through about a 20-minute little conversation with the sweet lady that was running the division. And she says, John, we'll just bring you on part-time. And by the way, we'll pay you, which I thought was a hoot. So 6 months later, they came to me and said, hey, John, we'd like to hire you full-time. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I'll just have to go home and tell my wife I'm going to make a whole lot less money. But but I'm going to have peace. It was such a wonderful thing just for that 3 or 4 months. So I got into it, as many things we do in life, Allie, not too much choice. I just, even to this day, years later, I have to say to myself, I cannot bear the thought of someone who is coming to the end of their life and don't have somebody just to say it's going to be okay. Somehow it's just going to be okay. And that's kind of where I am with that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a beautiful story and such a beautiful mission. For those people who may have maybe heard of what a chaplain is, but aren't super familiar with the job entails. What does that look like? Is it a religious position? Like, walk me through what exactly a chaplain is.
Well, some of the prerequisites for being a chaplain with most credible companies, you do have to have a biblical degree, be in good standing with your church. A chaplain's job is not to come into a patient's room and try to proselytize them, try to get them to say the magic words, whatever they are. Our job, as I say, is to be all things to all people. I've had people want to talk about a 70 Barracuda. I've had people want to talk about vacations. I've had people talk about their grandchildren. I've had people, and in that conversation, somehow I just want to, again, somehow get them to understand it's going to be okay. That this is just a season. This isn't the end. I think most of the medical industry doesn't really understand what chaplains do because, quite honestly, there's a little bit of, a little bit of arrogance that goes with that profession. Having said that, everybody that I work with and who've ever worked with have always been pretty spiritual people.
Yeah. Are all the clients that you see or all the people that you work with religious as well? Or do you see people who are agnostic or atheist?
I see all kinds. We want to be all things to all people. They will refuse chaplaincy sometimes because they either have a misunderstanding of what a chaplain does, or they just don't see any good in it. But seldom do I not get at least one opportunity to be visit with people. But it happens. Some denominations, and I won't mention them, have no use for chaplains. Yet say they're spiritual because they handle their own spiritual things. But on the majority, I meet all kinds of people, and that's the wonderful thing about what I do. I get to walk into a person's life, at the end of their life, and get to meet their families, get to live their lives, their stories, their wishes, their desires. That's what the blessing is.
That's really beautiful. And then in terms of, where you're seeing these people, do you work out of hospice care facilities, hospitals? Like, do you see people in their homes? What does that environment look like? And also, are people with others, or do you see people who are alone and by themselves?
Well, Allie, that could be two or three books. The greatest blessing that I take from all this is that when I walk into a patient's life, they have loved ones that have surrounded them, who've loved them up. Um, yes, there's been occasions where I've met people who have nobody, who, by the way, have tried to make amends, and even to their last breath, they were not able to do it. And it's a little bit sad. But I visit people with the company I work for now, I do not. But the place I worked before, I would go wherever the patient was. Hospital, nursing home, assisted living, their personal homes, wherever they were, I would go to them. Now currently work at one of our care centers, which is a wonderful thing. I've never had anyone say our care centers are not beautiful. I work out of there, but I do pretty much now home visits, and some ALFs, but I try to go wherever they need me to go.
What do you think people are seeking from you in those final moments of their life?
I think, Allie, someone to listen outside of the ones that they love. Because sometimes, and most of the time, they do a lot of downloading. I call it downloading. We like to call it wonderment or whatever word you want to use, but, they're starting to reflect. And in that reflection, our minds are an amazing thing. Those things that we've held back and not let come to the forefront comes to, I don't want to say haunt us at the end, but it comes to our memory at the end, all those little things. And it's just a process of sorting through those things. And, I've been honored enough to be a big part of some of that.
Mhm. In terms of what those things are, have you noticed a pattern or common things people are sharing with you at end of life, whether it's fears or regrets or things that they just want others to know? Like, what are some of those through lines maybe that you've noticed across patients?
With patients, whether they be what I consider to be a strong spiritual person, Christian, church member for 60, 80, 100 years, there's still a fear. There's still an apprehension. Met maybe 1 or 2 in my career. You gotta understand, with this company, I carry about 120 patients that I have to visit,
Mm.
uh, within 60 days. And I've seen a couple of them that said, "Perfectly happy, ready to go." But there's always I even had them outright apologize to me. "Oh, I'm so sorry I feel this way." I said, "Well, what are you
Aw.
talking about?" "Well, I'm a Christian and I should feel." "Don't tell me how you should feel. We only know what the scripture tells us what's coming. And you just have to, that's when faith kicks in and hope and all those things that we're taught. But I think the underlining concern is what's it going to be like? What's going to be, is this all there is? And then, I no longer am around in any sense of the form. So, it's a heavy subject.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also interesting it for religious people specifically too. It's like you've lived your whole life with faith and believing, and then you're kind of coming head to head with this moment of, okay, now I see. I'll find out if everything I've been believing is true and what's going to happen to me. Um,
That's
yeah.
absolutely true, but, the way in which we're built, the way in whether you're Christian or not, the way in which a Christian understands we're built with a fallenness to us, a sin nature, where we can never reach this perfection. The scripture says we reach perfection when we draw our last breath. So it's perfectly normal, even though sometimes, like I said, they try to hide that back in the back of their mind. Their mouth is saying one thing, but their spirit is saying another. And some of what I do is just say, "Hey, it's going to be okay," especially if they
Mhm.
want to talk about things that are more spiritual.
Yeah. Do you provide reassurance that, I'm hearing a lot of it's gonna be okay, but are you reassuring them in their faith almost that, like, heaven is on the other side or anything like that?
Absolutely, absolutely. The scripture tells us that the time it takes you to blink, when you open your eyes, you're with the Lord. Now, that's the assurance I give to those who are saved. When salvation is one of those things, and I don't want to breach that subject too hard, but salvation is for different for all people. It reflects in differently in everybody. Some will be never a Billy Graham. I'm using him as an example, but there'll be others that'll be a John Wenderlein, and there'll even be others that maybe never entered a church, but their faith was strong, their spirit was strong, and I let God sort all that out. Um,
Mhm.
Salvation is a one-time thing, so it's hard. Allie, it's like the guy who told me, because I wrote a book on Vietnam veterans who coming to the end of their life, and I remember the first time I talked to a gentleman who said, "I was in Vietnam." I said, "Oh." He said, "Yeah, but I didn't see any action." And I went, "Well, now my father was a military man, so I understand a lot about what it means to be." And I said, "Well, what did you do?" And he said, "Well, I was a cook." And I paused for a second. I said, "Well, let me ask you a question." I said, "When you were peeling those potatoes, if somebody would have run up and handed you a gun, what would you have done?" He said, "Well, I would have fought." I said, "Of course." Same instance with all this. Let's not lessen the fact that sometime in a person's life, the Lord came into it, and whatever that meant. I'm a little different minister than most. I like to stand on what the scripture tells me. So, um,
Mhm.
I want to meet somebody where they are, wherever that is. It's pretty quick. Most people can pretty quickly see if you're sincere or not, or you're just going through the paces. Uh,
Mm.
and I want them to know that I'm there. I've had hundreds of stories. I've met since the first time you and I talked. I've had 2 dozen encounters of just unbelievably sweet people that just come to my mind. So I think I do this because of me. I think I do this because I love it so much. I get the blessings.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the Vietnam veteran book. So you obviously wrote a book about veterans who were at the end of their life. What inspired that book? And maybe you could share a story or two that was really profound for you.
Well, we've pretty much said goodbye to all our World War II veterans. I had
Mhm.
one pass away last week. He was 102.
Wow.
He was he was in the Army Air Corps. Now, for someone like yourself who's so young, you would not know it, or maybe you do know it, but the Air Force didn't come around till 1948.
Mm.
So he flew for the Army in World War II, and he passed away. So, and then I just had my Navy diver pass away, who was 100 or 101. His job was to come to Pearl Harbor the day after we were bombed, and his job was to cut holes in the side of the ships and take bodies out. And then when he got the bodies out, his job was to weld plating back on those holes so he could float the ships. Those guys are gone. Those guys are gone. So what we have now, we have some Korean war vets that I don't ever forget. I just had a Purple Heart one die a week ago, who I loved and adored. So what we have now is we have Vietnam veterans who are 75-ish and older, who are becoming those people who are passing. And I tell you, it happened probably 2, 3 years ago. Had been called to the side of a patient without really having any sort of visits with him. He was coming to the end, and I didn't get the opportunity to visit. But you know, the little conversation we had in his room with his wife and 2 daughters, who were adults, when it was all done and he said goodbye, the wife turned around and told me, she said, "Chaplain, he's never told me those stories. He never told me some of these things that he went through in Vietnam, some of the atrocious things that you find unbelievable." Uh, and then other stories. But what I found a common theme with all these veterans from Vietnam, where they were never treated properly when they came home. They were spat upon, they were attacked, they were physically abused. They wound up, the fact is, I remember one of them saying, I'd come home in the LA airport with another friend. And he said, when we got off the plane, we were in our uniforms, but we were saluting out. We were getting out of the service. And he said he remembers getting attacked by these 8 or 10 people because we were baby killers. And I remember thinking to myself, I didn't kill nobody. And he said for 2 years, John, now he was a wounded veteran with a Purple Heart, and he said for 2 years I wouldn't tell anybody that I was there because every time I did, someone would talk disparagingly about me. Even to the point when you went to the VFWs. Now we would think the VFWs would be a place of solitude and they would be protected. But you know, I had a gentleman tell me a story. He says, John, you know, my older brother was a Marine and he came back. And I had just come back from the Army, and my younger brother had just been drafted into the Navy, and he was fixing to go. And he said, my father, who fought in World War II, said, sons, let me go show you off. Can we jump in my car? We'll go to the local VFW. It was
Sorry, for those who don't know, what's a VFW?
Veterans of Foreign Wars. What it is, it's a place where men who served and women who served get together. They have a common bond, but they had loaded up in their daddy's car and off they went. It took about 20 minutes, he said, to get to where they wanted to go. And he says that they were making a right onto the road where the VFW was. There was a big sign that they'd put in front of the sign of the VFW, and it said, Vietnam veterans not welcome.
My gosh.
It broke he said, I remember it breaking my daddy's heart. He said,
Wow.
that's the way it was. You know, the Vietnam veterans wound up having to form their own organization to take care of themselves. And that didn't happen until like 1985 or 6, or I may have that number wrong. Vietnam veterans had never been cared for. We had movie stars at the time, and one of them in particular, head over to the enemy and take pictures on their equipment. At the
Mm.
same time, people like our senator out of Arizona was at the Hanoi Hilton being tortured, and she stood on a tank saying how bad the soldiers were with our enemy. So having said that, I just sense that their stories need to be told. I, and they told some just they st- I in my book, my Vietnam veteran book, I say in one of my stories, it sounds like when he's telling this story, it's almost surreal because I think John Wayne has to be in that movie somewhere because it's just so unbelievable, his stories. The gentleman said, I was in a platoon, which was, he said, 13 men. I was on patrol. All of a sudden, there was gunfire. He said, "I was on my back in a rice paddy floating about 4 feet in the water, and I remember thinking to myself, 'I'm gonna drown. I think I'm gonna drown.'" He said, "Eventually, Chaplain, the gunfire stopped." He said, "And then all of a sudden, I noticed that the enemy was stripping all the valuables off the soldiers, uniforms, everything, and they were either shooting them or bayoneting them." And he says, "You know, Chaplain, there I was floating in the water, and all I could think about is my wife that I'd married 2 months before I went into the service, and how I would never see her again." And all the time he's telling these stories, I go, "It's just unbelievable. It's just unbelievable." He says, "You know, they bayoneted me twice in the back." He said, "I didn't feel it because I had been shot and I was paralyzed." This man was partially paralyzed. He said, "You know, I came back from the war. Took me 2 years to recover where I could, get around." And he said, "They said I would never have children." He said, "Well, I want you to know I got twin girls by the grace of God." So this are the kind of things that these men have held until, the gentleman I just told that story, I think passed away about a year ago. Most of these men came back from the war by 1970, 71, with
Yeah.
the, and there they were living these stories. So I just sensed that I needed to put it on paper. I needed people to understand. And that's why the name of my book is called Delayed Honor. It's
Mhm.
honor because they've never been given the honor that's due them. And it's just not right. 2.7 million men and women went to war, Vietnam War. We lost 56,000 of those. And about 1,000 we've just never recovered a body. That's those MIA things you see, never never left behind flags you see.
Yeah.
So, there you go. It's how is there not a book in that?
Yeah,
You know?
absolutely. It
But I
just makes you think too, like how long how hard it must be to come back traumatized, probably with so much trauma, so much PTSD, and to feel like you can't even seek support, seek help, can't talk about it because people will judge you and treat you awfully. Like, I just can't imagine doing something for your country and then having all of these terrible things happen to you and then to try and seek support after and you just can't. And oh my gosh, holding on to it for what, 40, 50 years before
absolutely.
you can actually express what's happened and how you feel.
It's ironic, in my studies, I wanted to study a little bit of the history of all this when I decided to formulate the book. And I remember reading countless articles that said, and I loved it. It said, very few Vietnam veterans were drafted into the war. They voluntarily went. And I think to myself, that's just hoopla. That's just a lie. Because what happened back then, they knew their draft number was coming up. It was a lottery, we had a number. But what was told to them, if you go in ahead, if you go in before you're called up, you'll get a better duty and you can also go
Mm.
in with a buddy. So many of them said, hey, and I had one of them said, I joined on a Friday and my lotto number came up on Monday. So
Right.
the idea that they weren't drafted, and a whole kind of a whole other subject. You know, you're 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 miles away from the enemy, and somebody has told you that you have to take a gun and you have to go kill somebody that you didn't, that you don't know. You have to take their very breath. That's a madness in itself, Allie. That's a madness in itself. But
Absolutely.
I wrote a, I wrote another book called Remember Me, and in that I have more, yeah, more pleasant stories, I like to say, than my Vietnam veterans. But I had a Vietnam veteran here the first of the week, just come on board. And what we do with a company that I work for is we want to honor them. We honor them with a pinning, certificate, and we have a group of ladies that will quilt the American flag in a beautiful quilt. And it's amazing how many of those men say, "No, I don't want it. I still don't want people to know that I served." But it's a shame.
Yeah. Does anyone seek forgiveness from you, veteran or not? I mean, it comes to mind because obviously in those sorts of war experiences, maybe you have killed someone or done something that might haunt you later on, but even just folks who were not in wars, like, are people seeking forgiveness from you at their end of life?
It's amazing that you bring that up because you're probably the first one that's ever asked me that. But I have to tell you, there's been times, Allie, that I've been shocked. And it's not easy to shock me. But
Mm.
I have been called. I remember the first time I was called to the hospital. A gentleman was just not doing well. Didn't expect to make it. You know, the things he told me in this confession were just extremely criminal in nature.
Oh my
Extremely
gosh.
criminal. I had to go and I had to talk to other chaplains to see, where I was, because my heart told me, one thing, and my spirit told me another. And
Mm,
so I've had those situations. Sometimes they're downloading all those things, not always pleasant, very seldom pleasant. Those
mm,
guilty things, big or small, many times I'm there to listen and there to, and a vast majority of the times, tell them it's going to be okay. It's just going to be okay. So it's tough. Yeah, people, I don't want to use a bad analogy, but the analogy is that many will consider us like a priest.
mhm.
Priest, you say confession. When I have a Catholic who's coming to the end, I get a priest to come do last rites. I don't do last rites, and in that, whatever that conversation is, it is. It's a private conversation, but so often they want to who them not being priests. The only ones that not me not being priest, excuse me. The only one they want to download to is myself, which is fine. But there's been a couple of instances where I've said, "Oh, you should have went to jail," or you want to not judge, but you want to say, "Oh, yeah,
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
glad it wasn't my kid." So I get, you just get a full spectrum of people's lives. People don't realize it. You never know.
Mhm. That's so interesting. Another thing that comes to mind is just the idea of regrets, and I wish I did this. I wish I did this. I can't believe I didn't or did do this. Like, do you hear a lot about regrets? And if so, are there any common regrets at end of life that maybe young people might be interested to know about and maybe factor that into their life as they're leading it?
Absolutely. I have no issue with this and that. We can never go back. It's the woulda, coulda, shouldas in life that always, without exception, come to boil up at the end. And the advice I have is the Lord, for me and a Christian, the Lord has a plan, and we do not know the plan, but we know we cannot second guess ourselves. It's always that way sometimes. If I would have just done this, if I would have, we like to second guess ourselves, but you know, we have to know that we have something that's ordained, however people want to say it, this life, and we're gonna follow a certain path, and in that path, there's going to be speed bumps, sometimes mountains, and we cannot and should not allow it to consume us and cause great sorrow at the end of our life. Because I tell you, for me as a Christian, my life's preordained. It's preset. So will I still not do it? Now, let's not be confused. I may still do it at the end of my life. I may still, who knows? I'm not perfect. But the advice I can give to young, as the Lord told those that he was standing next to, he said, live a full life. Live as if you're going to live 1,000 years and let me worry about the small things. Let me come get you when it's time for me to get you. Yeah, the reflection can just haunt people. That's why the majority of the patients that we have that come on service usually have to have a mood altering drug that will allow them to stay calmer. Because they've been given some bad news. They've been given news that's, typically when a person comes on hospice alley, they have been told they got 6 months to live.
Yeah.
Some live one day, some live 3 years. But when someone looks at you who you consider to be credible, a medical doctor, and says, can't do no more surgery, can't do no more treatments, um, this is what we got going on. It can be it could be a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of anxiety. So
Yeah.
when I meet a patient that is not taking that drug, I go, man, good for them, you know, which happens. Uh,
Mhm.
Not often, but it happens.
Yeah. So you would say there's very few people that you come across who are at peace with death and dying?
Well, I would say I don't know what the number is, but I have run across those who said I'm perfectly good. I've lived a good life. I've lived a full life. And I know where I'm going, and then we're good to go. I mean, it's just amazing. But then I'll have those on the completely other end of the spectrum that will go out screaming. Screaming means that we have attempted to medicate them as much as you legally can, unless you cause death, and it's not working. So
Mhm.
you get a full spectrum. Most people, they toggle right there in the kind of in the middle, maybe a little worried, north of a little worried. Typically, what happens, Allie, is been given the news, and then at that time, they start to sort through them at their end of life. They start to sort through that. Every waking minute, they're sorting through it somehow. Their mind is racing. So what happens is they've come to let's say, a peace about it or a complacency about it, one way or the other, about what's to come. And part of my job is to help them reach more of a peace than complacency. I want them to know somehow it's going to be okay. And in that, I've had wonderful meetings with wonderful people. I've held hands with people who've drawn their last breath. I've I've just been, I've been called to hospitals when people have passed and family members. You just never know. With every patient comes a different dynamic, family dynamic, personal dynamic, whatever is going on situation wise, it's got them to that point of near death or at death. So you just don't ever know. You walk into a lot of things somewhat blindly, but that's okay.
Mhm. Yeah, your role must be kind of interesting in that, are you seeing these people more than once, or how often do you see someone typically before they end up crossing over? And, you
Well, one
know,
thing,
I'm
yeah,
just thinking about those conversations. You almost have like this therapist role in that comfort, in that reassurance, in that validation. Um, but it would be interesting because your relationship, it has an expiry date, and that's just such a unique kind of thing, knowing that, I'm supporting you for potentially a week or potentially a month and not really knowing when that time is coming to an end.
you know, and that's the way it works. In the profession I'm in, we have many that come through the profession, nurses, mostly I say nurses, but CNAs are better. Social workers sometimes have problems, but the biggest problem they have is exactly that. They realize that their patients are not going to be around or not around, and they don't see any hope. I say it time and time again that I work with optimists. I work with no pessimists. I work with people who see hope in things that most people from the outside in would never see hope. So I mean, I don't know. It's just one of those things. I'm just trying to figure that one out.
Yeah.
No, I figure it
I
out
was gonna
daily.
ask, because I think someone listening would be like, man, I don't know if I could ever work in hospice care. That seems so upsetting, so tragic. Like, and you seem like the most positive, upbeat guy. And so I'm just wondering, like, how does this career, how is it not weighed on you? And how are you able to look at it as this, positive, hopeful experience when I think a lot of people, you're right, outside looking in would go, oh my gosh, that is so sad.
Well, when people meet me on the road, I carry a name badge, and they happen to see the word name hospice on there, and but then they see chaplain, and they go, "Oh, you're a hospice chaplain," and they go, "Oh." I could never do that. Oh, oh, boy, it's a bunch of O's.
Yeah.
Oh, you cry on my shoulder. And I always say, no, I love, it's funny because when I tell them I love what I do, they go,
Yeah, they're like,
suddenly
what?
I'm morbid or something, but I tell you the way it works. If you can look at this analogy is this, I'm going to be on call for the next week at the hospitals, like I told you. And that happens after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, after working a full 8, 10 hour day. And it's until 7 o'clock in the morning. And then next weekend, it's going to be the whole weekend that I'm on call. And I leave my clothes on a hanger because you have to wear certain clothes with the company logos and stuff, and with my shoes underneath it. When I get a phone call, when I get a ring on my company phone, Allie, I can't get dressed quick enough. I can't get to my car quick enough. I can't get to where I got to go quick enough to be there for whatever the situation is, because I'm led by something other than just, it's not a job. It's not a physical job. It can be an emotion. It's an emotional job. It's a draining job. 2 Mondays ago, I came to work on Monday morning, and over the weekend, we never know who's going to pass over the weekend, you know. But having one, maybe two, normally, we had eight
My
pass
gosh.
away. Three of them, I know they're on hospice, but I thought to myself, I didn't expect them to go now. We say things like that because that's what we do. Then I get 3 calls to be 3 different places with 3 different situations that people are passing. And by Monday afternoon, I'm going, man, what's going on, Lord? But
Mhm.
I wouldn't have traded that Monday for all the things in the world. In my other professions, I've done very well financially, and I wouldn't trade this job for 2 or 3. In fact, what it's done is caused me to decide maybe I'll work longer or longer. I have a retirement age is coming quickly, and I may just decide just to work longer because it's not work. Because something drives us, that you're talking about, this sense of, maybe this sense that we're not doing isn't anything, that incredible. It always seems to hit my nurses. Because, our nurses, the majority of the nurses that come on to hospice are nurses that were ER nurses, oh, evac nurses, those nurses that are right in the middle, right in the thick of it, and they just burn out 10, 12 years. They just need a break. So what do? They go, oh, I'm going to become a hospice nurse because that's just so much easier. Well,
Mm.
guess what? It's not. So 3 months, 6 months, they will say, I got to go. This is just too sad. This is just, but it's not. It's not intended to be. Um, I have just wonderful stories of people I wouldn't have changed it for the world. I mean, meeting these people and being with them at the last moment, holding their little hands, and I don't mind telling you a couple of those stories.
Please, yeah.
In my career, I did visit nursing homes. Now I no longer do that. Well, in every nursing home, and I had a dozen of them that I would visit to see my patients, I would always have the nurses in the nursing home. I would come to them and say, listen, now, I work for this company, but that doesn't matter. If you have a patient in here that just needs conversation, then you let me know. So sure enough, it happens that way. I have them, they'll say, can you go see this? And I say, as soon as I get done with my patient, I'll go see him. Well, I walked into a nursing home, and sure enough, one of my favorite nurses said, can you go see Miss Margaret? She's not doing well, and it doesn't look like her family's going to get here in time from New York. I said, sure. I walked in there. I never met her. She wasn't she wasn't on our service where she was on our care. I remember walking in and sitting down, and the room was dark and could barely see, and she was sleeping. And I walked up and grabbed her little hand, put it in mine. I said, hello, sweet lady. How are you doing? And she whispered, she says, well, who are you? And I said, well, I'm the chaplain. And Gloria, your nurse, said that you were worth visiting and I want to come see you. She said, oh, that's wonderful. She said, I'm just so tired. I said, well, I get tired too. And we had just small talk. But during our small talk, she kept falling asleep, which isn't unusual, you know, not unusual to fall asleep, whether it's because of medications or whatever reason it was. And finally I said to her, well, Miss Margaret, I'm going to let you go. And I'll see you later. Now she was asleep. Now, when I put her little hand, now it was a dark, almost a pitch black dark room. I could see enough, but when I put her hand on her chest, laid it on her chest, I happened to catch. Now that's one thing we do in the hospice business, is we pay attention to breathing, or the lack of breathing, or the lack of breathing.
Yeah.
And so I said, "I don't think she's breathing." So I walked out in the hallway and I said, "Gloria," I said, "listen, you know I'm not a doctor, nor am I a nurse, but I think Miss Margaret's gone." She had left. She had left this world, and I got the opportunity to hold her hand and pray with her because that's what she wanted. So she wasn't alone. She wasn't alone. And for me, that's very important. But those are the kind
Mhm.
of stories. I remember being called by a nurse and said, "John, I know this lady's not, she declined chaplaincy when she came on our service, but can you run by her house? She's not doing well." I turned right around from where I'm going and I head to her house. I met at the door by her, what I would later determine or find out was her daughter-in-law. So sure enough, up the stairs, it was like 2 flights up. There she was, a 75-pound lady in a grandma outfit, the all grandmas wear. I'm not sure where they buy those. And she's in this recliner that looks like I should be in it. And she was dead asleep. And there was the daughter-in-law, just she had been crying and crying. And I said, "It's going to be okay." So there was a little table that sat next to the recliner. So I moved it out of the way, and the sister-in-law took a seat on a couch kind of close to us. And I sat down on the floor, which was hard for me to get back up. But I sat down
Mhm.
on the floor, and I reached out and put her little hand in mine, and all of a sudden she woke up. And she looked over at me and she said, "Is it time yet?" And I said, "Is it time yet?" I said, "Is it time for you and I to go dancing? Is that what you're asking?" And she says, "No." She said, "I'm just so tired. I'm just so tired." Well, when I had found at the way at the door from the daughter-in-law, she had lost her husband 2 years ago. Her
Mm.
only son, who was married to the daughter-in-law, had died last year of kidney failure. And there she was by herself. She was 96 or 7, I can't remember. And I said, "No, sweet lady." I said, "I don't think neither one of us can dance anymore." And then she kept falling asleep and kept falling asleep. Well, I said my goodbyes, 10 or 15 minutes into this conversation because she kept falling asleep. And I got about 2 miles down the road and the nurse called me and said, "Chaplain, can you come around? She's passed away." So I turned back around and went there and, and you know, was with her. So those are the kind of stories. I have one other one. You talked about, you asked me earlier about, are they usually alone or they have loved ones? Well,
Mhm.
being on call, I'm also on call for hospice, which staggers the weeks, and which that means, no, not the hospitals, but if wherever there's a hospice patient not doing well, I go. Well, they called me to community in Orlando. Uh, didn't know the patient, no clue, but I got to the house and I remember thinking to myself, there's nowhere to park on this street. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. There's nowhere to park. And maybe it was a little frustrating. So when I knocked on the door, now this is only about a 1,100 square foot house, little block house. Uh, when the door opened, it was full of people. So I instantly knew where the cars, who the cars belonged to. So one of them said, "Oh, Chaplain, we're glad you're here. Great grandma was back here." So I hugged her down a little hallway and then walked into this little 11-foot square room. And there was this sweet little lady with 31 people around her bed. I counted them. I made sure I counted them. And at the same time, they grabbed a chair and they were passing it over people's heads to put it next to the bed for me. So I was managed to wiggle my way through and sit down. And Allie, when I looked up, if you can imagine going left or right to left, I've always been trained to look people in the eyes when I talk to them. And I looked everybody in the eyes as I went across looking at them. And it was amazing to me. The event was the same. The thing that was happening was the same. But in every one of their eyes, I sensed a different emotional condition or position. And I looked up and I said, I know many of you, by that time I'd gotten her little hand in my hand. By the way, I'm a pastor or a chaplain that has to touch. I think touch is essential. Touch is a sense of healing. There's this
Mm.
healing to touch. So I had her little hand in my hand and I looked across the room and I looked up at all those people. I said, you know, many of you people won't know this painter, but his name was Norman Rockwell. I grew up He was long dead or just about dead, but I grew up watching, looking at his paintings, and he was able to capture the essence of the moment. And as I look at you guys now, I said, this is a Norman Rockwell moment. I said, there's so much love in this room. And oh, by the way, Allie, guess what was beside her in her bed? It was a great, great, great grandbaby that had been born a month ago, laying beside her in the bed. So I spent my time with him. We had conversation, and she passed away the next day. But the point is that's what I've been blessed to get into. I mean,
Yeah.
I've been on the floor with a gentleman whose wife passed away as she walked across the floor. And he fell to his knees. Just they were married 78 years. He was and he wasn't in no physical condition, be doing what he did. And the family, who was all in their 70s and 80s, said, we don't know what to do. I came into the house, had to take my belt off because it would have bothered my big belly. And I hunkered down on the floor for 30 minutes talking to him, explaining to him it's going to be okay, that one day he was going to be with her. And now she's in a better place. And it was a 3-hour event. So you can see how it drains you emotionally.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I have stories and stories and stories.
Yeah, and such beautiful stories and such beautiful moments, such intimate moments in people's lives that you kind of have this window to, and this time of life that is just so confronting, but so many different emotions for so many people, and to know that life is ending, it's interesting that you would see people who are at peace and scared and everything in between. Like, I can't imagine the amount of emotion you've just experienced and witnessed, and people in whatever states you've talked to in this role. I have a few last questions for you before we wrap up, but my first is, what do you think it takes to lead a full life? What does that look like based on what you've learned?
Well, the world would say, have no regrets. Yes, what's that silly song? I did it my way. But that's not the way it works. All those people who sung those songs, who may have boasted on that fact, didn't die that way. They died still concerned that they should have done something different or could have done something different. I think the idea is, like I said earlier, whether you're a person who believes like I believe, just live a full life, live a full life and let the small details like dying come. The book of Ecclesiastes tells us that there's a time to live and a time to die, the time to cry, time to laugh. It's a song that was written. There was a song written about in the 60s. You know, it's this is just a season. It's not to be it's not to be woed over, or it's not to be it's not my last intentions is ever to make someone sad. I've had them crying and I say, listen, I haven't come into your room to make you cry. If I'm making you cry, I'm going to leave because you're going to make me cry. I was telling you stories a minute ago about Miss Margaret, and I started to cry again. I just didn't want you to see it. And she's been gone 5 or 6 years. So we never get over it. We just need to get on with it. And for the young out there, just fall in love, have a few babies, live a life. Because at the end of your life, there's one common theme and one common thread. When I look across those who have people who love them, is that they've left behind people. They've left behind something that's intangible, that you can't buy, that will not rust and fall apart. That's love. And for me, I have a daughter and grandchildren, and when I die, which I'm going to die, I want them to know first that I love them. Then everything else doesn't matter. So just live every day and love everybody who loves you. And
Mhm.
don't let people get to you where you have hate in your heart, because it just has no place.
I love that. Where can people find your books?
Well, like most book authors, I'm I'm on Amazon. Um, I have a website too, but if you go to Amazon.com, you'll find my books, Remember Me, End of Life Stories Through the Eyes of a Hospice Chaplain, or you'll find my Delayed Honor book in all its former fashions. I have a web page they can send me a note. It's called remembermejw.com. It kind of tells you a little bit about some of the interviews, some of the things I've done. Not too much, but it does. And that they can get a hold of me that way too, but it's relatively easy.
Amazing. Last question. How do you think we become at peace with death?
Well, there's that word that the Webster's Dictionary doesn't do justice to, and that's the word resolve. We need to resolve. And to resolve means to find something within ourselves that takes care of the issue, that comes to a sense of completeness, and that's resolve. Do we find peace at the end of life? I like to think we do. Um, at the very moment we're no longer here, and wherever people say they are. For me, I'll be with my Lord. I know that to be a fact because that's all I've ever known. But peace is one of those things that I can't always guarantee. But what I can guarantee that there's got to be something after. There's got to be something after this.
What do you believe happens after we die?
Well, I'm a Christian, in case you haven't figured that out by now. But for me, and I don't want to get too theological. I don't want to bore you too much with these degrees I've got. What happens when the Lord tells us in the scriptures, the moment that you blink no more, your last blink, you're with Him in paradise, the Lord. And the book of Revelation says, no more sorrow and no more pain. It goes on to the fourth verse, He'll wipe away your tears. Now, if you study that language, the Greek language that it's written in, that idea behind tears isn't the tears of a moment. It's the tears of a lifetime. He just wipes them away. So that's the only thing I know. Others will say, well, I'll just become dirt or I'm just going to become worm or whatever they say. But again,
Mm.
I sense my lot in life that came later in my life is to try my best to give them peace.
Mm.
Go
What a
ahead.
comforting message too of it's all gonna be okay, and there is something after, and there is more, and there's gonna be no hurt and no pain, like, I just think religious or not, I think that messaging when you're approaching something that is as scary to people as dying is s only positive, only beautiful, only welcome, no matter what your beliefs are, so thank you so much for sharing
You're
that with
welcome.
us today. John, thank you so much for your time, this was such an enlightening conversation, and I can't wait to dive into your books and hear all of those incredible stories from the people you've come across over your life and your career, so thank you so much for being here today.
Well, you're welcome. And hopefully I was informative. If not, call me back and we'll do it again.